Hi everyone, it's better late than never, right? So here is the RTX 3080 Ti buying guide. A short explanation on what the purpose of my buying guides are. I aim to inform people on which GPU models have better configured hardware and BIOSes. Sure, any GPU would probably perform similarly within a few percent at default regardless of the hardware and BIOS configurations, especially because NVIDIA has a minimum specification that all manufacturers have to hit, except for maybe the more extreme cards when overclocked. But with this guide, you're spending money on an expensive GPU, so you should be able to pick the ones within your budget that give you the best hardware and BIOSes. I always emphasize on the power limits, cooling and VRMs as the most important, because the new GPUs these days can boost their clock speeds as high as they can as long as there's enough power and temperature headroom, which makes the boost clock specifications pretty much useless. So the factor that actually affects performance in real life is the power limits and the cooling performance of the cards. This is why NVIDIA now makes brands list TGP or power limit specifications for the laptop GPUs, because it really does matter a lot in terms of performance. And this is also why I am quite annoyed that they don't list the TGP on the box of desktop GPUs, where different models from different brands might set wildly varying TGPs that affect the performance even if it uses the same GPU. Actually, an interesting example of this effect is on the OC versus normal BIOSes of some of these cards, where the OC BIOS actually runs the GPU at a lower frequency as a result of increasing the fan speeds, which eats into the GPU TGP power budget, showing just how power limited these RTX 3080 Ti's are. Fortunately, the power limits can be checked on the BIOS files, which are available on TechPowerUp's GPU BIOS database, as long as someone has uploaded it using GPU-Z. Which is why if you buy a GPU, please download GPU-Z and upload your BIOS file, as that'll help me and others when comparing different GPU models by seeing the BIOS files themselves. Now for cooling performance, it is also just as important, as the boost algorithm automatically boosts the clock speeds higher the cooler the GPU is. Not to mention, better coolers will usually mean lower noise levels and therefore a better user experience. Also important are the VRMs, which is the circuitry that provides the operating voltage to the GPU and the memory of the GPU. But for the memory, they're pretty much always not really important, so we're just gonna focus on the GPU VRMs for these types of comparisons. The VRM's current capabilities are very important for anyone that wants to overclock, especially if it involves shorting the power monitoring shunts that remove the power limits completely by fooling the power circuitry that it's drawing less power, usually called shunt mods. But for people who don't overclock, a stronger VRM will mean it'll be stressed less and will run cooler, which should last longer with all things equal. So let's start with the stock power limits or TGP, which for the RTX 3080 Ti can vary from 350 watts all the way to an insane 1000 watts. Contrary to popular PC myths, the power inputs on a card is not as important to end users, as the firmware or BIOS is what defines the TGP. However, the power inputs define how high the TGP that NVIDIA allows manufacturers to set. As a start, you can see that there are a lot of cards with only a 350 watt TGP, the same as NVIDIA reference spec, as they all are limited by the dual 8-pin power inputs. These will perform basically the same as an RTX 3080 Ti Founders Edition in the launch reviews. I'm really confused about all the water-cooled cards that are in this 350 watt class, as they won't benefit much performance gain from the better cooling with such a restricted TGP. Then again, 350 watts is already a pretty high TGP, when considering a few generations ago, the top-end cards were maxing out at just 250 watts, so the GPU power consumption has really skyrocketed in this generation. Then there are the 370 watt class cards, which with only a 20 watt increase over reference will again pretty much perform very similarly to the reference spec cards. Again, I am confused about the water-cooled cards like the Gigabyte Waterforce, which uses a dual 8-pin PCB that limits them to this TGP class, limiting the performance gain from the better cooling. Lastly, there are the 400 watt TGP cards, which if you're looking for maximum performance without manual overclocking, then these cards are the cards to get. Oh, and let's not forget the unobtainium special Galax RTX 3080 Ti Hall of Fame card with a 1000 watt default TGP. This, as you might imagine, is not a normal card. This is a card that is extremely overbuilt for the purpose of extreme overclocking under liquid nitrogen, which is why the 1000 watt TGP BIOS is available for this card is not the default one that it ships with. A cool side effect is that it is also downloadable from TechPowerUp's GPU BIOS database, which means for you daredevils out there, you can try flashing this onto your RTX 3080 Ti, although you might need to have the same number of power inputs as the Galax card. And this is not real advisable, or am I saying that it'll definitely work due to the different power inputs and display output configurations of the different card models. So your mileage may vary if you decide to try flashing this BIOS onto your RTX 3080 Ti. The next topic will be the maximum power limits. This will be very important for those wanting to overclock, as a higher power limit will let a higher clock speed that can be sustained without power throttling. Of course, you can also just do shunt mods to remove the power limit entirely, but the maximum power limit also serves to show how confident the manufacturers are in their card's quality, as they will usually set it at a level that's safe for the VRMs. Although, that is put into question when some GPUs started exploding running Amazon's New World game, which seems to smell like a wrongly set TGP limit or current limit in the firmware to me. Here we can see that there's an awful lot of cards that don't let you increase the power limiter above the default TGP or only a minuscule amount. These are again limited by their PCB design, which only uses dual 8-pin power inputs. These should be avoided if you have any plans to overclock, as not being able to increase the power limit will mean they won't provide a meaningful performance increase when overclocked. I am again surprised by the water-cooled cards in this class, which are just so counterintuitive to me because it just makes no sense to me. Why would you put a water cooler on a card and then put a really low power limit on it? Then there are the cards with the triple power inputs that can actually let you open up the power limiter to at least 400 watts or higher. The best candidates for overclocking will be the cards that max out the power limiter to 450 watts. As well as again the special RTX 3080 Ti Hall of Fame card at 1000 watts, because really at 450 watts, the RTX 3080 Ti is still severely power limited, so you really want to shunt mod the cards or use a really high power BIOS to actually max out the overclocking potentials on these cards. Next comes the VRM current capability of the cards, where higher current capability means a higher quality VRM that can handle more abuse. To give some perspective, the RTX 3080 Ti at 350 watts TGP run at about 0.93 volts to 0.96 volts, which means calculating using the equation current equals power divided by voltage, at about 0.95 volts, it'll draw around 370 amps, which is sufficiently lower than the cards with the VRMs only capable of 700 amps. At 400 watt TGP, it will be about 1 volts, which equals about 400 amps. But this is not as simple as that, as there is a need for headroom in the VRM current capability, as the current spikes generated by the GPU when gaming are actually much higher. As an example, the Founders Edition 3080 Ti shows power spikes up to 535 watts in short 1 millisecond bursts according to Iger's lab. This would equal somewhere close to 700 amps of current being drawn by the GPU, which now gives you perspective on why the base spec 700 amp cards don't have high power limits. Increasing the power limits on them would at best be risky and at worst result in a blown up VRM. These cards are really meant to be strictly run at default speeds and not much more. This is why I am again confused about why EVGA and Inno3D were putting water-cooled cards using very basic VRMs. Then there are also the cards that can deliver 800 amps and 825 amps from the VRMs. They are all still pretty limited in terms of power limits and therefore overclocking headroom. It's only when you reach 850 amps where their power limits are raised much more considerably than their lower end cards. I am a bit surprised however to see the Asus TUF and Gigabyte Aorus cards using a more powerful 880 amp VRM while only using dual 8-pin power inputs and a lower power limiter than the 850 amp cards. Then there are the EVGA FTW3 cards at 950 amps and the Gigabyte Aorus Xtreme at 990 amps, and as well as apparently Zotac's Amp Holo Xtreme card, which, to be honest, I am quite disappointed with. These models are often touted to go head to head with the Strix cards, but are actually inferior even from the VRM side. Although, granted, they're usually slightly cheaper. In fact, all the cards mentioned so far have an inferior VRM than the NVIDIA Founders Edition card. I would personally feel bad buying if I am paying more for them than the Founders Edition. On the other hand, there are the 1080 amp Asus Strix cards, which uses a much more premium PCB design than the other cards and even has advanced MPS 2888A voltage controllers with solderable pins to let you adjust voltage externally via an external I2C controller like the Elmore AVC. This is the card to get for extreme overclocking, along with the utterly insane Galax Hall of Fame card that was really purpose-built for overclocking as well. Then the colorful Vulcan also looks to have a mighty powerful 1100 amp VRM, but there's not much more info on them on how they perform and also what voltage controller it actually uses, so I'm guessing it's just a basic voltage controller, so the Asus Strix and the Galax cards will be much better options for extreme overclocking than this one. You might have also noticed I now have the NVDD and the MSVDD VRMs listed in the graph. The NVDD is the main GPU voltage rail, which is why it has a higher current capability, and the MSVDD is a secondary voltage rail. Together, they make the GPU VRM. I just want to highlight this data because it shows some interesting data points. Because I found that on some of these cards, they might have a really high total GPU current capability and a power limit, but then they have a very mediocre MSVDD VRM. The main concern with this is that the GPU power is limited on the board as a whole, which is why the fan speed can also affect the GPU's clock speed. So there's nothing stopping the GPU from drawing most of the power budget from the MSVDD VRM and potentially overdrawing it and blowing it up. Which means ideally you want a VRM that is well balanced with a decently strong MSVDD along with a really strong NVDD. So what stands out to me is how Pellet and Gainward seems to set up their VRMs to be much heavier on the NVDD side compared to the other cards in the same VRM current level. If you sort by NVDD, we can see that the higher power limit cards are in line and mid-high positions in the chart. But if you sort by MSVDD, we can see that the Pellet and Gainward cards suddenly are mid-low positions and the MSI and EVGA cards seem out of place considering their really high power limits. To me, it's really odd that these cards have the highest power limits at 400 watts but are positioned lower than the lower power limit cards when we sort by MSVDD VRM current capability. Even the Asus TUF and Gigabyte Aorus cards, which have lower power limits, have MSVDD VRMs that are much stronger. Now, no one really knows what exactly gets powered by the NVDD and the MSVDD outside of NVIDIA, and maybe the board partners. We just know that it powers different voltage rails on the GPU core. So how much the current load is split exactly is not really clear, but I really would feel much more comfortable overclocking the Asus, Gigabyte, Zotac, Galax and colorful cards, considering the high overall VRM capacity and the more balanced approach to the MSVDD VRM, especially if you plan on doing shunt mods that will remove the power limiter completely or raise it significantly. Now for the cooling performance of the cards, it is impossible to find the performance results on every model as not every one of them gets reviewed. But as usual, I did gather the performance results of the cards that did get tested, especially ones from Guru 3D, TechPowerUp, Hardware Lux, and Kit Guru, who seems to do some of the most consistent and thorough GPU reviews. I combined these results by correcting the temperature to TechPowerUp's results as they had the most GPUs tested. I did this by calculating the average delta of temperature and noise measured on the same cards that TechPowerUp tested and correcting any card that isn't tested with that, which results in this combined graph. If we sort by temperatures, we can clearly see the liquid-cooled Asus Strix card is definitely the winner here as expected. For the air-cooled cards, the MSI Suprim is definitely the best here as it's dissipating 400 watts while staying much cooler than the Founders Edition at the same noise level. The Gigabyte cards also seem to do very well here, and it looks like the Eagle uses the same cooler as the gaming card when considering it stayed at basically the same temperature but slightly quieter when considering it also uses slightly less power. The Palette GameRock and EVGA FTW3 cards are probably at the same level as the Gigabyte cards when considering they are dissipating more heat. The KFA card and the Zotac cards seems to be similar as well, with the KFA card being slightly better, while both seem to be slightly better than the Founders Edition. Then the Palette Gaming Pro is definitely another step down, and even seems slightly worse than the Founders Edition considering the higher noise levels at similar temperatures. Lastly, the Inno3D cards just seem to be the worst performing cards here, with the temperatures and noise levels higher than the other cards, even though their coolers are actually quite big. If you sort by noise levels, you can now see how mighty impressive MSI Suprim X card is, especially with the silent BIOS, being quieter than Asus liquid-cooled card, although having the same temperatures as the Founders Edition card. The Gigabyte Gaming and EVGA FTW3 cards also seem to have a very well-tuned silent BIOS, which is in stark contrast to their performance BIOS being some of the loudest cards. Meanwhile, Palette could have turned down their fans more in their silent BIOS to be quieter as well, as their temperatures are still more than fine. If you're looking for the quietest cards, pick the ones at the top of this chart. Now for the rest of the cards, which don't really have any reviews on them, I have made this cooling performance tier list as usual. This is to be taken with a grain of salt, as these are just observations I made considering many factors, such as the type of heat pipes, heatsink size, number and size of fans, and the cooling performance of said heatsink model used in a different GPU if they have been reviewed before. But this tier list should still serve pretty well to determine how a card's cooler performs roughly to a different one. Just don't make it out as a fully accurate tier list, but considering more of like if it's in the same class, it'll probably perform pretty similarly. First off, there are the water-cooled cards, which are obviously going to be at the top of the chart in the S tier. There is just no way for air-cooled cards to compete with them. Then there are the A tier cards, which are the top of the line air-cooled cards. I would for sure say that the MSI Suprim and the Asus Strix are probably the best ones here. All the other ones should be pretty similar considering the previously reviewed RTX 3080 and 3090 with the same coolers. Then there are the B tier cards, which are a slight step below in cooling performance. They should still perform well, but might not be as quiet as you would need to ramp the fans up to compensate for the generally smaller heatsinks compared to the larger A tier cards. Then there are the C tier cards, which still provides good cooling performance for a stock power limit RTX 3080 Ti, similar to the Founders Edition card. Then there are the D tier cards, which has cooling performance that I would class as worse than even the Founders Edition card. This is especially because these cards are often using heatsink designs brought up from their RTX 3080 models, where they were already marginal at best. So going up to the higher wattage 3080 Ti is just really asking for trouble. Lastly, let's put the cards into a tier list, with the cards also being ranked from best to worst. I factor in all the pros and cons of each card to place them above or below another card. This is really just my personal opinion on the different models of the same GPUs. So you can also interpret this as I would always pick a higher tier cards over a lower tier one if I were to buy one myself. So starting at the top, I would put the Galax Hall of Fame card and the liquid cooled Asus Strix LC cards as the SS tier. The Galax for having the most insane overbuilt VRM, and the Asus Strix LC cards represent the top tier cards for being used daily while being overclocked to the maximum. Then I would get the EVGA liquid cooled cards over the Asus Strix cards because, well, you would gain a lot of performance headroom from cooling the cards down, especially with similar power limits, even though I don't really like their VRMs. So I would actually prefer the Asus Strix cards if I were to modify it and liquid cool it myself due to its much better VRM. The Gigabyte Aorus Xtreme would also round out the S tier, as it is also one worthy of this class with a good cooler and a good VRM design, along with a higher power limiter. The A class consists of the Gigabyte Aorus water-cooled cards, which can't go to a higher tier because of the low power limits, as well as Zotac's Holo Xtreme, as well as the Arcticstorm cards, which are surprisingly good in their VRMs as well as their coolers. Then there are the MSI Suprim cards and the EVGA FTW3, which have good coolers and a high power limit but a weaker VRM. Then there are the B tier cards, starting out with the Palette GameRock and Gainward Phantom cards, which have high power limits but weak VRMs and coolers compared to the higher tier cards. The colorful Vulcan OC, Asus TUF, and Gigabyte Aorus Master cards have good VRMs and good coolers, but have a power limit that is really set too low for the hardware. The NVIDIA Founders Edition card has one of the best VRMs, but the power limit is set really low due to the relatively weak cooler. But this card is a very good card to shunt mod and slap a water block on, and you can really just not care about the VRMs because they are really powerful. Now speaking of water blocks, there are the EVGA XC3 and Inno3D water-cooled cards, which are on the bottom of the B tier because water-cooling cards with weak VRMs and low power limits are still, again, very counterintuitive to me, so I just wouldn't place them any higher on the list even though they cool really well by being water-cooled. Then there are the C tier cards, where the MSI Gaming Trio and Gigabyte cards, which all have very good coolers but then a very mediocre everything else, so I can't really place them higher either. Colorful's Advanced OC, The Zotac cards and the Galax EXG are similar in using a decent VRM, but then use a mediocre cooler and power limit setting. Then the Galax SG, MSI Ventus, EVGA XA3 cards are just okay all around cards and have nothing particularly terrible about it, but also nothing particularly good about them either. So yeah, they're just here, I guess. Lastly, there are the D tier cards. These cards are mostly just for people that want any RTX 3080 Ti's and have no interest in overclocking and also don't really care about the temperature and noise levels. They just want a card and don't care about anything. Because these cards, they're basically what you might consider reference spec cards that meet the bare minimum specifications set by NVIDIA and nothing more. In fact, they might perform slightly lower than the NVIDIA Founders Edition card, which again is different to the NVIDIA reference specification. The Founders card is NVIDIA's premium card that they make themselves. Now, I won't pick a best all-around GPU or anything like that this time because, well, most of you can't really pick anyways, so yeah, I would just use this GPU buying guide by choosing the highest ranked cards of whatever options you're presented with. Therefore, you get the best cards that you can get. But yeah, that's about it for this video. I can't really do anything to help with the GPU shortage with the video, but I really hope that this will help you guys buy the best cards you can get when you are presented with the opportunity. And I hope that you learned something useful from this video as well. So leave a comment down below if you have any questions, and leave a like if you like this video because, well, dislikes can't be seen anymore, so that's kind of useless. But if you want to click it, just go ahead and click it, I guess. I don't really care. And subscribe if you want to see more of buying guides like this. And yeah, well, thanks for watching.